Ladies and gentlemen, if you've been wondering why the world around us seems to be falling to pieces, there's a very simple answer to your question. We are living in the only decade of the past 100 years that does not have a brave, unflinching dog to save us. Not yet, at least. Rest assured, there is most likely one in the pipeline. Some young pup amazing his owner with the ability to see through solid rock, successfully operate an iPad, or bark the theme tune to MasterChef while simultaneously disassembling a Heckler & Koch assault rifle with his hind legs. Now, heroic hounds have played a pivotal role in human history, from classic literature right through to the popular movies of the 20th century. So I'd like to begin by discussing some of the heavyweights of the genre that everyone will probably be familiar with. Since most of us were weaned on television, we can probably remember watching the eponymous border collie Lassie performing in one of her 8 movies or long-running TV series. As one of the most bankable female stars of the 20th century, Lassie was consistently cuter than Reese Witherspoon and tougher than Sigourney Weaver, despite sharing a little more in common with Jay Davidson from The Crying Game than it was comfortable for a child to know. You see, in each of Lassie's incarnations, the dashing heroine was played by a well-hung dog called Pal. Female border collies are generally much smaller than males and have a tendency to molt heavily in the summer. Since the anorexic look was not yet in fashion, Pal stepped into the fray. Refreshingly, the canine labour unions were kept satisfied by the fact that most of Lassie's stunt doubles were bitches. As to how they kept Lassie's cock and balls hidden from the inquisitive eyes of smaller viewers, we can only speculate. One presumes the key grip or some such minion was delegated the task of taping the said appendage to the hound's belly. Having attempted this myself whilst researching the piece, it is not a practice I would recommend. Moving quickly on, Lassie Come Home in 1943 marked the first appearance of our hero, in which she starred alongside fellow luminaries Roddy McDowall, who would later be famous for playing an ape, and Elizabeth Taylor, who would later be famous for marrying several. Amongst Lassie's many talents on show were the ability to act as a defence lawyer for a wrongly accused man. A stroke of luck for him that young McDowall understands every bark of the primary eyewitness and is granted the clemency of the court to translate into human speak. Taking a break from her law practice to answer the call of duty for her country, Son of Lassie, 1945, takes place in Nazi-occupied Norway, where the faithful hound crosses vicious fields of German fire to come to the succour of fallen men. Bizarrely, the titular son of Lassie is played by Pal, and his mother Lassie is played by another border collie. Perhaps his contract stipulated that he play the correct sex at least once in his career. We will touch upon our own canine war hero shortly, so don't go away. In fact, stay. Good audience. Having disposed of a brigade or two of pesky Nazis, Lassie returned home, thankfully excused from giving evidence at the Nuremberg war crime trials. Like most returning servicemen, she was faced with the prospect of coming to terms with the horrors she had seen in Courage of Lassie in 1946. Fortunately, the buxom young Liz Taylor was on hand again to rehabilitate the combat-hardened and shell-shocked hound. There followed 2 years in the wilderness, rumours of alcoholism abound, before the release of Hills of Home in 1948, also known as Master of Lassie. Our hero has now been somehow transported to Scotland, where she must persuade a doctor to allow his son to study medicine, a slightly more pedestrian adventure than 1949's The Sun Comes Up, in which she is accused of murder. With a career fast heading the skids, Challenge to Lassie in 1949 cast the old gal back to 19th century Edinburgh to reenact the Greyfriars Bobby story about a dog that cannot live with the loss of its master, holding an endless vigil by his grave. Quite sad, really, and hardly box office gold. So Lassie's big screen starring roles came to an abrupt halt 2 years later with Painted Hills in 1951, which sent the dog even further back in time to the 1870s, where she helped a prospector mine his gold strike. Lassie accomplished the rare feat of acting alongside 2 of cinema's biggest names, John Wayne and James Stewart. Although disappointingly absent from the cast of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, she did put in a turn opposite Jimmy Stewart in the turgid 1978 remake of Lassie Come Home, unwisely entitled The Magic of Lassie, the 70s apparently being quite magical. She wisely refrains from singing any songs, although the rest of the cast do tragically indulge themselves. John Wayne also had the privilege of witnessing her thespian skills in his two movies, Hondo in 1953 and Big Jake in 1971, wherein legend has it that the Duke won Lassie from her longtime owner in a particularly lubricated poker game, but gave her back to the heartbroken man the following morning. What happened during their one night together is anyone's guess. The main inheritor to Lassie's crown was perennial favourite Benji, who has to date acted in 5 cinematic features. In Benji's case, one does not use the verb acting without some gravitas, for in his debut performance, Benji, 1974, no lesser authority than the New York Daily News gave him the following review. Benji's uncanny ability to project emotions definitely makes him the Laurence Olivier of the dog world. That's my New York Daily Times reporter's voice. Unabashedly male, Benji triumphs over small-time crooks in his debut, which was the number 3 box office success of the summer of '74. There followed a spell on the Greek islands in 1977's sequel, For the Love of Benji, bizarrely leading to the reincarnation of a private eye in Benji's body in Oh Heavenly Dog in 1980, which also starred Chevy Chase, so enough said there. In Benji the Hunted in 1987, he is washed up on a desert island and must raise a bevy of cougar cubs in the wild. His next foray onto the big screen was as recently as 2004 in Benji Off the Leash, which you may have missed whilst blinking. Despite the disappointment of an ordinary career after a sparkling beginning, Benji products and properties have grossed an estimated $235 million US. Young Miss magazine voted him number 5 all-time male in a reader poll in which he narrowly pipped Burt Reynolds. And he is still the sole canine actor to appear as a centerfold in Playgirl magazine, although he was young and needed the money at the time. That is true, actually. Benji's sole rival concentrated more on television success, although it did have one stab at the big screen in 1979. The Littlest Hobo was a Canadian German shepherd who traveled from town to town, helping those down on their luck, before moving on, as his song went. Maybe tomorrow I'm gonna settle down. Maybe tomorrow I'll just keep moving on. He was essentially a canine version of the Incredible Hulk, also popular on TV at the time, although Hobo did not have to keep an eye on which housewives were hanging out their washing, so he could pick up a fresh, unripped shirt. Initially a TV series running from 1963 to '65, the big screen foray revitalized Hobo's fortunes, resulting in a new series which ran from '79 to '85. Speaking of the '80s, those alive way back then may recall box office hits Turner and Hooch in 1989 and K9 in 1988, though you may be forgiven for forgetting its sequel, K9000, wherein at least there's a genuine reason for the dog being supernaturally clever, as he is a robot. This reasoning also applies to Doctor Who's K9, which came in very handy for Tom Baker, although was often left behind to face the Daleks alone when the Doctor escaped up a handy flight of stairs. This worrying subgenre of dogs as replacement partners for embittered detectives was at least more gratifying than the slobbering phenomenon known as Beethoven, cinema's 90s canine star. This moronic addition to the canon does little to inspire the confidence in history's heroic hounds we so desperately need, and is perhaps only worthwhile for the near-maiming of David Duchovny. These many celluloid canine heroes are not entirely without precedent. In classic literature, the motif of the supremely gifted, capable hound is extremely common, and it has to be said, fairly irritating. An early appearance of such a magnificently clever specimen was in Edgar Allan Poe's sole full-length composition, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which was published in 1838. The dog, Tiger, helps his master to overthrow the mutineers who have seized the ship from Arthur's friend Augustus. Tiger is initially smuggled on board the Grampus with his young stowaway master, but proceeds to throw a slight spanner in the works by eating all the food, and then turning on Arthur in a peak of madness brought on by rabies. Dogs were tough in those days, though, and a good drink of water soon had Tiger back on his feet and ready to rip the throats out of the evil mutineers, though he at least stopped short of taking the helm and setting a course for Hawaii. Jules Verne was a big fan of Poe and featured a smarty-pants dog of his own in his 1874 opus Mysterious Island. This slightly unhinged novel begins with insanely clever engineer Cyrus Smith crash-landing the balloon he has pinched from the Confederate Army on a desolate, remote atoll, dragging several unfortunate friends along with him. He then proceeds to build civilization from scratch, with his dog, Top, playing a key role in the ragtag group's survival. Essentially a man in a furry suit, Top consistently exhibits a level of intelligence and ability far in excess of any modern-day canine equivalent. When dangling over a precipitous cliff face, a character merely has to whistle for Top, who comes a-running. "Top! Good boy! Run and fetch the captain, and if you can't find him, bring a length of rope." The hound obliges, returning moments later with the requested equipment. "Good. Now tie a shank knot in the rope and lower it down to me." "No, I said a shank, not a half reef." "Where's the captain anyway?" "What's that you say? He's playing canasta with the cook?" "Damn his eyes." One has to wonder how much exposure the average 19th century European reader had to exotic animals. For in Mysterious Island, the group befriend and train an orangutan to act as their house servant, going so far as to dress him up and teach him how to bake muffins. Poor old Jupiter is in fact a substitute female character, relegated to performing the household, or in this case, cavehold, tasks which are clearly below a gentleman's remit. Allusions to his role as a compliant, uncomplaining sexual outlet for the crew perhaps say more about Verne's feelings towards how women should behave, rather than any natural sailor's penchant for monkey love. In another memorable incident, Top fights a hideous dugong whilst going for his morning dip in the lake, an animal we now consider to be a harmless, seagrass-eating bundle of cuteness. Verne likens it to some kind of Loch Ness monster, which fortunately turns out to be quite tasty once Jupiter has added a few spices from his orangutan kitchen. One can only speculate upon the methods used for training animals in the 19th century, for it seems such art has been lost to us, as we become more reliant on dogs as friendly companions rather than potential lifesavers. Being a hunting man in his day, my father owned a series of extremely intelligent, fast-learning dogs during my formative years, most of them Labradors. The last in this mighty dynasty was Sam, a huge cream-colored Labrador with a gentle nature and the uncanny ability to catch leaping salmon from the local river like a bear. Sam would stand astride the rocks in the shallow salmon runs and snatch the fish from the air as they made their way upstream to spawn, chewing on them enthusiastically before my father could wrestle them from his jaws. My ever-scheming father sensed a loophole in the law that would enable him to save money, and thus allowed his fishing license to lapse, relying instead on our trusty family pet to provide Sunday lunch. If the gamekeeper made an appearance and asked my father to produce a permit, he could simply reply, "I didn't catch them, the dog did. Ask him for his license." Despite this show of intelligence from Sam, I remained unconvinced of his ability to rescue me from a mine shaft, primarily because he spent most of his spare time engaged in licking his penis instead of practicing tying reef knots. The nearest mine shaft was also located in Wales. Whilst we're on real-life examples, let's talk about Sabi, the Australian Army bomb-sniffing dog who went MIA in Afghanistan after a firefight with the Taliban in 2008, during which 9 soldiers were wounded and 1 Victoria Cross for bravery was awarded. Sabi was captured by the Taliban and held for 14 months until she was rescued by an American Special Forces soldier who could only be named as John. John saw her in the company of one Mullah Hamdullah, a minor Taliban leader in Kas-Oruzgan province, and recognized her as a military dog straight away. Presumably she was wearing a bandana. Negotiations with the Taliban began for the return of Sabi, with Hamdullah at first requesting that his father, a prisoner of the Americans, be released. After a little thought, he changed his mind, though, and asked for $10,000 instead. Presumably the prospect of a plasma TV was more appealing than being reunited with dear old dad. A meet was arranged, but Hamdullah was fooled by the wily Americans, in particular John, who was frankly getting a little sick of all this nonsense, and who resolved the situation in the speedy style characteristic of the US military, by holding a gun to Hamdullah's head and taking the dog from him. Sabi was presented to Kevin Rudd on November 11th last year, much to the chagrin of local Taliban leaders, one of whom was reported as saying, when the Australian Prime Minister came to Afghanistan, they showed them on the news together. It must have been a very high-ranking dog. No, you Taliban scum, she's just an ordinary true blue Aussie heroic hound. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, momentarily overcome by an unfettered outbreak of meaningless patriotism. Now, the most talented canine to exist in literature or film has undoubtedly been Krypto. Never heard of her? Making her first appearance in 1960, Krypto landed on Earth to the unfettered joy of young Clark Kent, who must have seriously wondered what his father was thinking, sending the family pet into orbit on a test rocket. Struck by a meteorite and sent spinning into the depths of space, Krypto somehow managed to navigate her craft to the bosom of her owner in Smallville. Putting Lassie and her imitators to shame, Krypto was blessed with X-ray vision, super strength, invulnerability, and the power of flight. Wearing naught but a yellow collar and fetching red cape, she appeared irregularly in Superman comics over the years, spending most of her time living in, wait for it, the Doghouse of Solitude. Yes! Which was constructed with her own fair paws from meteor fragments. Her hobbies include chasing comets, just like Earth dogs chase cars. Rumors of a torrid affair with Benji were dismissed as pure speculation, but at least she managed to stay out of the porno industry, unlike her beau. There are indeed too many heroic hounds to mention in great detail here. Tintin Snowy, Rin Tin Tin, All Yeller, Digby, the world's biggest dog, the cast of The Incredible Journey, Trigger, and Inspector Rex, whom I recently watched take the controls of a speedboat whilst fighting a bad guy. Reminiscent of the classic scene at the end of Face Off between John Travolta and Nicolas Cage. It is, of course, inevitable that pets should find their way into literature and film, as they are an integral part of human life. But is it not troubling that so often these animals are cast in the role of hero? Are we so uncertain of our own abilities to act correctly and without moral judgment in trying situations that we must turn to our furred companions for help and guidance? Or is it simply that in a canine hero, we see exactly the sort of person we want to be? Strong, taciturn, capable, independent, courageous, and able to lick our own genitalia. In any case, do not be surprised when the next super dog appears on the scene to thrill and amaze viewers across the globe. Perhaps even with enough support and inducement, Benji may be persuaded to run for office. His people say he never inhaled. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to my rant about heroic hounds. Look out for my forthcoming book next year, Sunburns I Have Known and Loved, in which I will talk some more of this sort of nonsense. And you've been a very good audience. Yes, you have. Yes, you have. Thank you.